On fishy sub. Let's go.
Yep.
On fishy sub. Let's on fishy sub. Let's on fishy sub. Let's on fishy sub.
Oh, sorry, I missed. Oh, it was good. Hello. GP is good. That's good. Also, a lot. Yes, for more viewers. Hey, Bells. Oh yeah, I'll do my locker tour. I was gonna upload one, but I just didn't. Yeah. Well, I just bought keycaps for it, so. Here's my locker. I do have Heidi. I also have glue somewhere in here. Yeah, right here. No, here's my Spidey sense. And then here are the back blings. And the pickaxes. There's some sweaty ones in here. But I'm using Candy Axe right now, so. You all saw it? I don't really like them. Let's play some Lannis, guys. If you guys... Oh, I don't know why I had matchmaking in. I don't do challenges, so... Like... Why'd you say what the F? Oh, why is my chair so long? Oh, oh. He came out of nowhere. How? Oh, nice, Mason.
Alright, we got Ting on.
She like, puppy, I adore you. I'm like, baby, I ain't normal. Foreigner. She like, puppy, I adore. She like, puppy,
I think your girl think you back in this.
Bruh. I am dead.
Seconds.
Thank you guys for 140 subs, much appreciated. Alright, to 1K.
There is a small hole in the ground in Australia that has claimed the lives of at least 16 people. Today, I'm going to tell you what's inside of that hole. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the like button out to a beautiful restaurant outside of town, and when they get out of the car, tell them you only said you were going to take them there, and then drive off. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Australia decided to bring his horses to a watering hole on the other side of his large property. As he was leading the horses across this big, wide open field, one of his horses suddenly just collapsed to the ground. The farmer ran over to see what was going on, but as soon as he got over to it, the horse had stood back up again and seemed totally unhurt. The farmer was puzzled because he had no idea why the horse fell in the first place, and so he looked down to see if maybe it tripped on something. And he saw on the ground right beneath the horse was this small hole. And so he moved his horse out of the way, and then when he came back to look at this thing, he saw it was only maybe a foot across, but when he peered down into it, he saw it was very deep. And so he got down on his hands and knees to get a closer look, and when his eyes adjusted, he could not believe what he was seeing. 10 or 15 feet below the surface was this huge pool of clear water. The horse had just stepped into the roof of an underground cave. And so the farmer was really excited to see how big this cave was. And so he grabbed all his horses and he brought them back to the stable, and he got this long measuring rope with a weight at the end of it. So he runs back out to the hole, he puts the weight into the hole, and he begins paying out this rope. And so down it goes, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. It just keeps on going and going until finally the weight hits solid land at 120 feet.
He
The
does.
farmer's like, wow, this is a huge cave. So he pulls it back up thinking that's the bottom, but in reality it wasn't. It actually extended down almost 300 additional feet. The farmer and his horse had just accidentally found one of the most beautiful and deadly freshwater caves in the world, called the Shaft. The reason it's called the Shaft is because the only way in or out of this underwater cave is through this hole in the middle of this field that this horse created, and it's literally a shaft that goes down 18 feet until it reaches the surface of this massive underground body of water. The opening to this shaft is so narrow that cave divers, they can't get into it with their gear on their backs. So they literally need to be lowered into this cave by themselves, and then their gear is lowered down after them, and they put it on while they're treading water. The solid ground that the farmer's weighted line had touched at 120 feet, and he believed he had reached the bottom of the cave. What he had actually touched was the top of something called the rock pile. The rock pile is basically this huge underwater pyramid that looks like a rock pile that sits at the bottom in the middle of the cave. And from the top of this rock pile, you can go down it in all different directions, but once you get to the bottom, there's only two tunnels to choose from. There's one that goes west, basically down at an angle, that dead ends at 260 feet. And then on the other side of this underwater pyramid is the eastern tunnel, and that's much more treacherous. It goes down at a more steep angle to 400 feet. The few elite divers that explore the deepest recesses of the cave say there are three distinct stages. Stage 1 is from the surface to 120 feet top of the water. During this stage, the diver swims unobstructed in beautiful clear water with sunlight poking through the hole. It's a very easy section of the cave. And there's a safety line that's anchored from the surface straight down to the top of the rock pile. So you have something to hold on to as you go down and back up. Stage 2 is where things get a bit dicey. Stage 2 begins at the top of the rock pile and extends down all the way to the bottom of the westerly tunnel at 260 feet where it dead ends, or down to the 200-foot mark of the easterly tunnel where you come to something called the drop-off ledge. And it's quite literally a ledge in the middle of this tunnel where beyond it there's a fairly steep drop-off, and it leads down to an area that's so treacherous it's got its own stage. Starting with stage 2 and then with stage 3, there is no safety line to guide you in the direction you need to go. So you're on your own as soon as you reach the top of the rock pile. And so you make your way down any direction you want down the rock pile until you reach either of these tunnels, and as soon as you go into them, you immediately start to lose visibility because the sunlight cannot penetrate all the way into these tunnels. And so the diver becomes increasingly reliant on their flashlight. As such, they have to be very careful as they navigate down stage 2 to not bump into the walls, because doing so will knock the limestone silt off of the walls. It will create a cloud of it in their face. It will blind them. It's like being in fog, where a flashlight can't push through it. And so the diver has to either wait for the silt to clear, which could take a very long time, or they have to swim blind. Also, anyone entering stage 2 and stage 3, they can't breathe regular air out of their tanks. There's too much nitrogen in regular air. The deeper you dive, the more nitrogen your body will absorb, and if you have too much nitrogen in your system, it can give you something called nitrogen narcosis, which is like being really drunk. And in extreme cases, people have been known to take their mouthpiece out and inhale water, believing they're on the surface, or they'll confuse the direction up with the direction down, and when they get to the surface, they will swim straight down and back up again. And so divers that are going to be in stage 2 or stage 3 of this cave will breathe a special mix of gases that are low in nitrogen. The final stage of the shaft, stage 3, is just from the cave, so that drop-off ledge, all the way down to the bottom at 400 feet. This stage
It's
is
the hole that has killed
unbelievably
16
dangerous.
people. Also,
So hot.
Hi.
Who are you?
I'm Tomorrow. Sweaty sleepers aren't too crazy about me. Casper. It's a Casper snow mattress.
As soon as you drop off that ledge, all the sunlight goes away. It is pitch black, and the tunnel narrows considerably and stays incredibly narrow. In fact, many times divers have to squeeze themselves past sections where the rocks are too close together. And so because you're inherently bumping into the walls all through stage 3, you're pretty much guaranteed to be silted out the entire time. At this depth, nitrogen narcosis is virtually guaranteed, even if you're breathing a special low nitrogen mix of gases. And so divers need to be ready to abort the dive at any moment if they feel symptoms coming on. Once the diver has turned around and is making their return trip, but they're still in the third stage section of the cave, they need to be careful of false stones. These are offshoots on the ceiling only in this third stage that look like the way out. And especially when things are silted out and it's dark, you're low on oxygen, you might be panicking, it'd be very easy to confuse these with the way out. But in fact, these false domes are exactly what their name implies. They are false, they are dead ends. They go nowhere. Stage 3 is reserved exclusively for extremely experienced cave divers who get special permission. In 1973, 8 divers got permission to dive the first and second stages of the shaft cave. They did not get permission to dive the third stage of the cave. On May 28th of that year, the 8 divers arrived in that big open field near the cave opening and began prepping their gear. Their plan was to dive down all the way to the edge of the drop-off ledge, so looking into the third stage, and then once they got there, look around for a minute and then turn around and head back up to the surface. These 8 divers were experienced divers, but their experience was all in open water environments. None of them had dove in a cave. And so they were confident divers, but they were a little bit naive. They believed the dive down to the edge of the third stage was going to be fairly routine and would just be simple and fun. But before any of them had even gotten into the water, they had already made a critical mistake. Instead of jamming their bottle with the special low nitrogen mixed gas that they would need going into stage 2, and so that's a requirement, instead of doing that, they just jammed their bottles with regular air. So they were basically guaranteeing that they would get nitrogen narcosis. But once they had all their gear prepped, they made their way over to the entrance to the shaft, and one by one they were lowered down into the water and their gear would follow. And then once all of them were all jocked up, they grabbed the safety line and they began their descent. It only took about 2 minutes to get down to the top of the rock pile, and there they spent about 5 minutes taking pictures of each other before heading down the eastern tunnel. 3 of the divers were siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine, who were 25, 22, and 19 respectively. And Glenn remembers after they made their way all the way down the eastern tunnel and they reached the drop-off ledge, he remembers seeing his sister, his brother, and all the other divers. Everyone seemed just fine. Everyone's just looking over this ledge. They're taking turns, kind of peering down into this black abyss that is stage 3. And then after 5 minutes or so, Glenn looked at his gauge and he saw his air was getting fairly low. Not emergency situation, but it was time to leave. And everybody else had the same amount of air as he did, and so everybody else was running low on air. And so Glenn was about to grab his sister, who was several feet right in front of him. She was still looking over the ledge down into stage 3. But when he reached out to grab her, she and all the other divers just suddenly jumped forward and dove straight down into the abyss out of sight. They dove into the stage 3 section. This was not something that Glenn was tracking anybody doing. This was not something anyone said they were going to do. This was not part of the dive. This was very dangerous, and they weren't allowed to go down there. And so Glenn immediately swam down after them to try to grab his sister and stop her, or grab his brother, or grab any of them. But as soon as he went over that ledge, he saw it was totally pitch black. It was completely silted out from all these divers suddenly launching over the edge. And so Glenn knows he's not going to find them in the silt. It's also very dangerous for him alone to just dive down there. And so he figures, you know what, I'm sure they're fine. They probably planned this out. Everything will down a little ways. So I'll just go to the rock pile and wait for them. And so Glenn turns around and he goes up back over the drop-off ledge. He makes his way to the rock pile and he just sits there facing the eastern tunnel, waiting for his brother, his sister, and the other divers to come back out again. But they don't. And finally, his air gauge gets so low that he literally has to go to the surface. And he's thinking to himself, if my air is this low, what are they doing down there? 24-year-old Larry Reynolds was one of the divers that went with Glenn's sister and brother and the other 2 divers into this forbidden third stage section of the cave. Although he doesn't say this, it sounded like he and the others just wanted to go a little ways into this off-limits section, check it out, and then turn around and go back to the surface. And so Larry would say, as soon as they went over the ledge and they're in this third stage, it went completely pitch black and the tunnel immediately constricted dramatically. And so as they're going down this very tight and pitch black tunnel, they reach a section that's so tight, they're down on their stomachs, literally pulling themselves through. And so after a few minutes of the group forcing themselves into this unbelievably dangerous place, it's like they all collectively realized, this is a terrible idea, we need to turn back. And so as they all began turning around, they realized their return trip just back up to the drop-off ledge, which was only maybe 25 feet, was completely silted out. And so Larry tilted right, and Larry turned around and went back into the silt, back up in the direction of the rock pile, touching the ceiling, looking for that entrance into the false dome to try to help Christine and Roberts. But he's not finding it, and he's looking at his air gauge, and it's getting critically low, and he knows if he doesn't go soon, he's gonna die. And so at some point, after not finding the entrance to this false dome, he decides he just has to go out and save himself. And so he manages to get out of the silt, he goes up and over the drop-off ledge, he gets to the rock pile, he grabs the safety line, and he fins himself up to the surface. When he gets to the surface, he looks around, and there's only 3 other divers up there, one of which is Glenn. And Glenn, he looks visibly panicked, and he yells to Larry, "Hey, have you seen my brother and my sister? Have you seen the others? Are they coming up after you?" And Larry looks at him and just shakes his head. He didn't know what to say. He knew they were gone. But for Glenn, this was his baby brother, his baby sister. He had to go back down. And so with the little bit of air he had left, he put his mouthpiece in, he turned around and he drove straight down as fast as he could, staring towards the opening of the eastern tunnel, praying that his family members and his friends are going to come out of there. And as he's swimming down and he's running out of air, no one's coming out of that tunnel. So finally, when his air was basically empty, he had to turn around and return trip back to the surface and realized his siblings and his 2 friends were gone. It would take 11 months and 11 days to finally locate and recover all 4 of the bodies inside of the cave. John, the 20-year-old who Larry saw swimming in the wrong direction, was found fairly far down the eastern tunnel, laying on a rocky outcrop. Glenn's 22-year-old brother, Stephen, was found just 50 feet from the entrance of the shaft, but it's believed he died at a much lower depth and then floated up to that position. Glenn's 19-year-old sister, Christine, and the 28-year-old man, Roberts, that she was with inside of the false dome, were found embracing each other just under the false dome inside of the tunnel. Investigators believed when they were in there, they couldn't find the exit, and then realized that they had so little air that even if they found the exit, they would not get out in time. And so knowing they were just minutes away from death, they abandoned looking for the exit and instead just embraced each other while they died. And then afterwards, they floated down of the false dome. After this tragedy, the shaft was permanently closed to all divers, but years later, they would reopen. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is.
I'm gonna do the same thing I've been doing at B, and eventually they're gonna go to B. They're gonna come to me.
Raina, can I drink some milk from you?
Ew. Let's get
Congressman Stephen Horsford is delivering for Nevada.
Today's story is about a hidden message found on the side of a mountain and how its contents changed the lives of 3 people forever. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in
You mean Nevada Tiki?
story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and warm up both sides of their pillow before they fall.
I live in Nevada. I live there, Foxwood, Nevada. JP is going there, aren't you in Reno?
Fall asleep. Also, please subscribe to Mexico, and it goes all the way up to the very northern end of Washington state, right on the border of Canada. It takes the average hiker, if they're going to do this entire trail in one go, about 5 months, unless there's bad weather conditions that impede them along the way. John had been excitedly planning this epically long hike for the better part of the last year. He'd actually typed out 6 pages on his typewriter of this itinerary that planned out every single detail of this hike, down to how many ounces of coffee he would need at every stop along the way. John was especially excited about this particular hike because it was going to be the very first hike he would be doing after his retirement from being a social worker. And apparently John had huge plans for his retirement. He wanted to travel all over the United States. He wanted to go to Australia, to China, to Russia. He basically wanted to hike at least 6 months a year, every single year, until he was too old or too weak to continue to do so. But just a couple of days before John and Ken were supposed to fly out to California to begin the Pacific Crest Trail, Ken told John that he thought they should actually postpone the start of this trip by about 3 weeks. He said Southern California had experienced their snowiest winter in decades, and so it would make sense to wait a little bit of extra time to make sure all the snow had melted and that they didn't get caught in any sort of late snowstorm. Now, John was totally not having this. He had spent so much time thinking about this trip. He was so excited about it that he just couldn't wait any longer. And so he told Ken, "I'm sorry, I'm going on the current timeline, whether I go alone or not." And so on April 19th, 2005, John made his way to his office where he was a social worker. His coworkers threw him a very small retirement party, and he literally left the office, went straight to the airport, and he flew to Southern California all alone. When he got there, he took a chance and reached out to one of his other hiking friends, a 48-year-old tool salesman named Lynn Paget, and asked him, hey, I know you live in the area. Would you be interested in coming on at least part of the Pacific Crest Trail with me? I'm going to start here in the next couple of days. And John was extremely excited when Lynn said, you know what? Sure, I'd love to come along with you. And the two of them made their way over to Campo, California, which is right on the border of Mexico, and they began their hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. But after going only about 100 miles, Lynn's feet started swelling so badly that he could not go any farther. And so from that point onward, John would be alone. The San Jacinto Mountain Range is the first major mountain range that the northbound Pacific Crest Trail hikers will encounter. And statistically, it's actually the most dangerous portion of the Pacific Crest Trail, as 15% of all the fatalities that occur along this huge trail occur in the San Jacinto Mountain Range. It's a very steep mountain with a rapid rise in elevation from the desert floor all the way up to over 10,000 feet, which means in the summer, even when it's extremely hot down around the base of this mountain, it will probably be windy and snowing at the top. John reached the base of the San Jacinto Mountain Range on May 2nd, and as he began his slow climb up, all of the hikers he was encountering were all talking about the same thing. There was apparently some big snowstorm that was due to hit the San Jacinto Mountain Range in the next couple of days, and so all of these hikers were actually evacuating the mountain to go to this little town to wait out the storm. Everyone's fear was they would get caught on Fuller Ridge when the storm hit. Fuller Ridge is towards the top of the San Jacinto mountain range, and it's probably the most dangerous part of the entire mountain range. It's basically this totally exposed, very steep section where if you lose your footing, there's nothing to stop you from tumbling down to your death. But when John heard this, he wasn't fazed at all. He was not about to evacuate because of some storm. He was just going to continue up this mountain, go over Fuller's Ridge, and carry on along the Pacific Crest Trail. And so for the rest of the day, he just continued up the mountain and eventually made camp about halfway up. He actually stopped near 2 other hikers that were also going to push through despite this storm.
Oh, yeah.
It was a 46-year-old
I saw
nurse
that
from
one.
Canada named Connie Davis and her son, 20-year-old Alex. And they were both very experienced high-altitude climbers, and they had all the right gear, and they were very well prepared. And so that night, after both parties had set up their camp, they struck up a friendly conversation, during which John made some dismissive comments about Connie's parenting style that really agitated her, although it didn't seem like John really noticed he had upset her. And so needless to say, the next morning, Connie and her son had packed up and were long gone by the time John was waking up. So John just got up, he looked at the sky, it was still clear, although he did see some gray clouds rolling in, so he could sense that yes, a storm really is on the way, but he decided he was still just going to continue on towards Fuller Ridge. So he put his backpack on and he began walking up the trail, and a little while later, when he was nearing Fuller Ridge, but was still several miles away, 3 very well-equipped hikers that he had not seen before came charging down the path towards him. And John stopped them and he said, "Hey, how is it up there? What's the weather like? What's Fuller Ridge like?" And they kind of looked at John and sized him up, looking up and down, and they saw that, he's got light clothes on, he's got sneakers on, he doesn't have trekking poles, he just looks totally ill-prepared for what he's walking into. And they said to him, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to continue on here. This storm is going to hit any time now, and we're not going to Fuller Ridge. We're actually turning around and leaving because of the storm, and we have all the right gear. I mean, you should really consider turning around and leaving." But these 3 hikers would say there was just no way they were going to change John's mind. He was totally dead set on carrying on to Fuller Ridge. And so the 3 men that had told him not to go eventually just said, "Okay, good luck." And they carried on down the trail, and John continued up. But despite John's earlier confidence in his plan to go to Fuller Ridge and continue through San Jacinto Mountains, when the snow actually started to fall sometime in the mid-afternoon, John started to have doubts about his plans. There was already a lot of snow on the ground where he was from previous snowstorms, and that was making it hard to see the trail as it was. And now with all this additional snow starting to dump down, he was worried it was going to totally cover up the trail and he would lose it. And since he knew he kind of had a penchant for getting lost on trails, this was a real concern. But he was still very stubborn, and so despite these second thoughts, he just continued on along. And so after a while, he got to within maybe 1 or 2 miles of Fuller Ridge when he spotted up ahead of him 2 other hikers that seemed to be going in that direction. And so he ran up to them and he yelled for them to stop. And at this point, the snow is really starting to come down and the trail is completely wiped out and he can barely see in front of him. And these 2 hikers, they stop. And so he runs up to them, and when he gets up close, he can
Step into a world of endless possibilities. All the elements you need for your next big breakthrough are all
see it's actually Connie Davis and her son Alex from the night before. And so Connie is obviously not thrilled to see John again, but when he explained that he was having a really hard time staying on the trail and, could he just tag along with them, Connie said, "You know what, that's just fine, we're happy to have you." But she explained to him she was not going up to Fuller Ridge. Instead, she was taking a more circuitous route that would bypass the ridge. It would take a lot longer, but it would be safer given the weather conditions. John assured her that that was totally fine. He would just trail along with them, and then at some point he would break off on his own, and he would go up to Fuller Ridge, and they could go their separate way. And so Connie, her son, and John begin walking along together. Now, Connie and Alex, they had crampons on their shoes, which are basically like metal cleats and allow you to very easily grip the snow and ice. They had trekking poles, they had all the right warm gear, and so they're easily moving along through these weather conditions. Meanwhile, John didn't have trekking poles or any high-speed equipment. He did have crampons that he tried to put onto his shoes, but because he had sneakers that were not lined up to this type of crampon, they didn't really fit right, and so it caused him to constantly stumble and fall on the ground. And so that's how it went for a while until Connie and Alex reached this critical point. It was at this creek where they needed to go down and around, which would take them away from Fuller Ridge. And if John was going to continue like he said he would up to Fuller Ridge, that would be the point where he would break off from them and go up the mountain towards this ridge. And so Connie and Alex wait at the stream. They're turned around and they're looking back down the trail at John, who's fallen way behind at this point. And as they're looking at him, they're thinking, this is going to take a long time for him to finally catch up to us. And so Connie, who really wasn't all that keen in hanging around John that much longer anyways, she figured, you know what, John has made his intentions completely clear. He said he is going up to Fuller Ridge. He is an adult. He is healthy. He can do whatever he wants. And so she yelled and waved to John and signaled that she and her son were going to go down this creek and this way to Fuller Ridge, so best of luck to you. And then Connie and Alex disappeared around the corner. Once John's hiking partners had gone, John got up to that creek and he was going to try to go up to Fuller Ridge, but by that point the snow was practically blinding. And so at this point John decided, you know what, I do need to turn around and go back down the mountain and evacuate to that town where everybody else had gone to avoid the storm. And so John turns around and starts trying to backtrack along this trail back down the mountain, but the trail is gone. The snow has completely whited it out, and there's no other hikers anywhere nearby, and even if there were, he wouldn't be able to see them. And so for several hours, while it was still light out, John did his best to navigate down the mountain, and then when the sun went down, he really had no idea where he was. And so instead of trying to stay on this trail that at this point he really didn't think he was on, he looked out away from the mountain, and way down below he saw this big bright cluster of lights. Even through the falling snow he could clearly see those were lights of a city. And so he decided he would use that as kind of like his North Star, and he would just continuously walk downhill towards those lights. And so for several hours he just began walking towards these lights, narrowly avoiding huge drop-offs and climbing over boulders and avoiding trees and animals, and finally he got to this very critical point in his journey down to these lights. He reached this area called Long Valley where he had a decision to make. He could either continue down the mountain, which would require jumping down into this ravine that once he did, he would not be able to climb back out again. It was too steep. Or he could turn around and hike way back up the mountain and go some other direction. But at this point, he had really no idea what direction was the best direction. All he knew is he needed to go down the mountain because his situation was getting worse and worse by the second. If he didn't find shelter soon, he might get hypothermia and just die out here. And so he decided he would jump down into this ravine. And so he laid on his stomach, he lowered himself down over the edge, and he dropped down into the valley below. Once he stood up, he just continued walking down the mountain, and at some point he spotted a stream that he began to follow along. And as he followed this ravine, which was taking him straight down the mountain, he noticed the ravine walls, these huge walls on either side of him, seemed to get closer and closer to him, like this ravine was kind of coming to a point. And then after a while, he noticed up ahead, the stream just kind of disappeared. And so he walked a little bit farther, and then he came to an abrupt stop. The water had disappeared because it had flown off a 100-foot cliff that he was now standing in front of. He had come to the edge of this huge waterfall, and there was absolutely no way to lower himself down over it. It was an absolute fall to the death if he attempted to go down this waterfall. And so he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and these huge canyon walls that had followed him all the way to this edge from when he dropped down, they were sheer cliffs. There was no way to climb those. And his initial drop into this ravine was unclimbable. He knew that going in. And so he was boxed in, he was trapped, and he likely knew that it would be at least a week or more before anybody figured out that he was even missing. And so totally disheartened, John left the edge of this cliff, this waterfall, and walked back up to a relatively flat area farther up the ravine, and he began to set up camp. He pulled out his green tarp, he put some line between two trees, he made a makeshift roof, he laid out his bed mat underneath, and then he climbed underneath the tarp and he settled in for a long night. The next morning, when the sun came up, John attempted to make a fire, but none of the wood he was finding was dry enough. So all of his fires just kind of smoldered but didn't really catch. He had a mirror, a signal mirror, and he was prepared to flag down any aircraft that flew overhead, but no aircraft did, so he didn't flag anyone down. And so by the end of that night, he was back under his tarp, having made no progress, settling in for another freezing cold, sleepless night. The next morning, when the sun finally came up again, John was totally disheartened, and he decided to start jotting notes down on the margins of his map, which was the only place he had space to write. He figured he would keep a sort of diary. That way, if he didn't get out of here, someone would figure out what happened to him. And so his first entry was that day, May 5th, and he wrote that his friend Ken was right. He should have postponed this trip by 3 weeks and avoided the bad weather. Ken was the smart one. And also in this May 5th entry, he took an inventory of his food supply. He said he only had 12 cheese crackers left. And then on May 8th, John wrote a note that said,
"Your mattress shouldn't jiggle. Theirs does. Tempur-Pedic doesn't, because Tempur-Pedic mattress
took a fall, too weak to climb out of canyon, down is a gorge, no way out." This was the message that Gina and Brandon discovered when they stumbled on this campsite. But the significance of this note was not literally what he wrote, but rather when he wrote it. On May 6th, Brandon Day and his girlfriend, Gina Allen, were in Palm Springs for a business convention. Brandon was a financial advisor, and so he was out here for business, and Gina was his guest, so she was really just vacationing. And so towards the end of the convention, when Brandon had some free time, he and Gina decided to leave the hotel and go on a hike somewhere. And so they actually linked up with a tour group that was leaving the hotel, that was heading over to this tram station where they were going to take a tram car all the way up to the top of the San Jacinto mountain range. A tram car is basically like a ski lift, except once you ride it to the top of the mountain, you don't do any skiing, you just do sightseeing. And so Brandon and Gina, they get to this tram car, they hop inside, they get to the top, and it's totally amazing, beautiful view, there's snow at the top, and they're told they have about 20 or 30 minutes before their group is going to take the tram car back down again. And so Brandon and Gina decide to kind of venture off away from the main group and have some alone time before they leave again. And as they kind of venture off, they start to hear what sounds like a waterfall. And so the two of them are kind of looking around, asking if they can see it or if they know where it is, and they don't. And so they say, "Hey, do you want to just leave the trail and walk towards this waterfall? It can't be far. It sounds like it's only maybe a couple of minutes away. We'll take some pictures, we'll come back, and then we'll catch the tram back down again." And so they decide this is a great idea. They leave the path and they start walking towards the sound of this waterfall. But after walking for a pretty significant distance, they realize the sound of this waterfall is not getting any closer. It seems to actually just be getting farther and farther away. And what they didn't know was happening was the sound of the waterfall was actually echoing off the walls of this mountain. It was basically playing a trick on them. The acoustics made it seem like it was really close, but really it wasn't. It was pretty far away. And so by the time they finally did locate this waterfall, they knew they had ventured fairly far off the main trail, and they really needed to, and they had a wallet and some chapstick. They had no water. When off in the distance, they notice a green tarp strung up between trees. It was John's campsite. And so Brandon and Gina, like John had mentioned in his May 8th note. But unfortunately, after walking for a little while, they reached that cliff with the 100 down to the edge of this cliff and look out into the valley to see if maybe there was a way down. And so he walked along the river, stopping periodically to get a sip of water until he got to the very edge. And when he got there, he looked down and know for sure is that in 2005, when John Donovan was still alive and missing, had he been rescued, he would have left the valley with all of his supplies, including those matches, which would have meant in 2006, when Brandon and Gina found themselves in that ravine, there wouldn't have been a way to start that fire, and so they would have died. In fact, the helicopter pilot that did come up and rescue Brandon and Gina, he would say there was nobody planning to search that area. This was not an area they believed Brandon and Gina would be. And so it really was only because of that fire that those two lived. As such, the couple said they owe their lives entirely to John Donovan and his unbelievable sacrifice. On July 11th, 2006, a funeral was held for John in Virginia. 80 people showed up for it. Most of them were his hiking friends from his club. After the service was over, they all kind of poured out onto the cemetery lawn around John's gravesite, and as the bagpipes played Amazing Grace, Lynn Paget, the man who had done the first 100 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail with John before his feet swelled up and he had to leave, he walked around the crowd handing out red Solo cups filled with a tiny bit of John's favorite whiskey. And then after making sure all of the adults had their drinks, Lynn went to the head of his very good friend's grave and he delivered a beautiful eulogy. In it, he tells the crowd that he thinks of John all the time, he misses him terribly, and at night he has the same dream. He's walking down this trail next to a stream, and then the stream bends off to the side, and as soon as he walks around the bend, he sees this green tarp. And he knows it's going to be John, and so he yells, "Hey comrade, hey comrade!" And as he's walking over to the tarp, he realizes John isn't there. All it is a tarp, a pack, and some shoes on a rock. As for Brandon and Gina, they did stay a couple after the ordeal, but they would...
LAB, we be shooting shit like Pixar. Tie a nigga like a knot. Have to beat the wave while these little niggas.
This video has 1 million likes for no reason.
Like a cigar. Saw LAB, we be shooting shit like Pixar. Tie a nigga like a knot. Have to beat the wave while these. From the bed, I'll be taking them pics, looking at it. Met a girl named Macy.
That's what Coco was attracted to.
No, that's what Piper was attracted to. Alright, what is this? This one's really hard.
Girlie.
I just wanna fuck all night, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
In my family, we store all our chocolate in the freezer, where it belongs. One thing that doesn't belong is slavery in the chocolate industry.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
It jumped up a notch.
It did, didn't it?
In my family, we store all our chocolate in the freezer, where it belongs. One thing that doesn't belong is slavery in the chocolate.
Listen to the noise that was made when lava is poured on glass. Raise the volume.
He wants a pour. He wants a pour, y'all.
Listen to the noise that was...
PS5?
Yeah, I'm the guy you're looking for.
You Cobra?
Zeke, right?
Is that the PS5?
Yeah. You got the cash?
Yeah, but I want to see the merchandise first.
Yeah. You can trust me.
Yeah, it's all there.
Now, for that money.
Okay, so today we got a package, and you might be wondering, what is this? Let's just say it might be one of the coolest things I've gotten sent up.
Cool, it's there.
Anything else?
I'm looking for the controller. Oh, there it is.
Good. Where's my money?
Here it is. Go ahead and count it.
Don't need to. I trust people.
That's a good sign.
What is that, a cop?
What?
If you're feeling like you need a little bit of company, you might be.
want their consoles back. We have PS5s now.
Well, that's because you camped out all night to get one. Turns out it was a smart move.
What was I saying about faster, smarter? That's how you get into the Overwatch tournament.
Oh, I'll get into the Overwatch tournament. Did I tell you my mom's getting me a PS5?
Oh, is your mom gonna play it for you too?
Oh, the only reason you beat me is because you have a faster console. Just wait until I get mine. I'm gonna bring the barrage on you.
Logan wants a PS5 so he can enter the gaming tournament. But how will he afford it?
That's St. James Place with 3 houses. That's $1,200.
You know, this play money looks really real.
Yeah, Steve gave it to me. Those hacker packs have such realistic play money.
Well, don't accidentally go out and spend it then.
No,
They want their consoles back.
I was just wondering if I could draw you.
Okay.
Go, let me draw you? Okay. Just give me a second. I'm actually really good. Okay. Can you give me a bit of a smile? I think it will just express a little bit more. You know?
I can't smile.
That's alright. You know, we all have our limits. Maybe like a nice little wave, like a little friendly. Oh, that's perfect. Alright, nice. Okay. And I'm done. Thank you.
No, you violated her.
Can I dance with you?
It's over.
The new dual field hunters are out, and they come in every rarity from common to legendary. They take AR ammo and have a magazine size of 16. This is the legendary version. It does 68 headshot and 34 base damage. The special thing about these dual wield guns is that they do double damage to cube monsters. This means that you can pretty much one-shot most of the cube monsters. But other than that, it's kind of... I probably won't be using it in a regular fight very often, but what do you guys think of the new gun? The new dual field hunters are out, and they...
I'll come over right now. Where do you live?
It's spooky season, so we're gonna make a horror movie starting with our first victim being Billie Eilish. Dog, if you could see this and like commenting on it, that'd be absolutely mint. Second victim is YNW Melly, going crazy bastard to kill that man. Victim 3 is Future. I don't know what this killer's problem is, but he's wild. Victim 4 is 50 Cent. This killer is out of his mind. Our last victim is Lil Pump. We got one survivor.
I need you to tell me if this counts as cheating in Minecraft Hardcore. As you can see, I'm currently in the Nether surrounded by creepers. All you have to do to get out of this situation is save and quit the title, and then just go ahead and reload the same world. Now, as you can see, none of these creeper explosions are going to kill me. I need you to tell me if this counts as cheating in
Okay guys, I'm gonna end streams. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys